Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. I'm speaking to you from the land of Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and would like to acknowledge those owners and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today's program is a special one as it presents the first of many for our newly appointed Asia Society Victoria Distinguished Fellow, Mr. Manoj Kohli. The fellowship is a partnership program between Asia Society Australia and the Victorian government to bring the best minds and ideas from Asia to Victoria and Australia and promote greater strategic, economic and cultural connectivity between Australia and our region. In appointing Manoj as the Victoria Distinguished Fellow for 2020, we acknowledge Australia's national mission to strengthen business as well as people-to-people relationships with India. In a moment, I will hand over to Victoria's Commissioner to South Asia, Michelle Wade, to formally begin today's proceedings and introduce our experts. However, let me quickly go through some housekeeping. We hope that today's session can be as interactive as possible on an online platform. The discussion will run for approximately 20 minutes, maybe a bit less, given our technical issues, and we will then move to Q&A from the audience. As we go along, please feel free to submit your questions and comments through the live chat box at any time, located right of your YouTube live video stream. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Wade, Commissioner for Victoria to South Asia, to kick off today's event. Michelle is a highly experienced international trade official, has held senior diplomatic postings for the Australian government in Italy, Malaysia and Spain. She commenced her role as Commissioner to South Asia for the Victorian government based in Bangalore in September 2017. Over to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Philip. And thanks to everyone who's joining us here today. So on behalf of the Victorian Government, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this public event with two such highly regarded expert speakers who I've met over my years and through my work. First of all, the appointment of Manoj Kohli to this fellowship position with the Asia Society is very timely. And I thank Philip and our colleagues at the Department of Premiers and Cabinet for making this possible. Victorian Government has a 10-year India strategy that's been in place almost since I arrived, since start of 2018. And it's a great pleasure to be working with the government to deliver that strategy and with business to work to double our exports and business engagement with India. It also is part of strengthening our people-to-people links, and obviously Victoria is an education state and we've got a great many young people from India studying in Victoria today. So as the Commissioner to South Asia, it's my role to facilitate these connections. I thought in talking a little bit about the green sector, I'd just mention a couple of companies from Victoria who are really doing some extraordinary things in that space. From pollution monitoring, we've got a company called Ecotech, which is doing most of the monitoring in many states across India for air pollution, and probably the second biggest company in that space. So a small company you might not have heard of, but doing significant work in India. The other one is our leader in water management, Rubicon, who's doing significant irrigation projects across the state of Karnataka, where I live in Bangalore at the moment. But we've also been working in the startup space with Energy Bootcamp, doing startup exchanges and selecting some of the leading Indian startups who've performed very well in some of the programs that we've been running in collaboration with them over the last 3 years. So it's great that we've been able to appoint Manoj Kohli as the Victoria Distinguished Fellow. Manoj and I actually got to know one another because he reached out to me in his former capacity as the CEO of Softbank Energy. And in our meeting, I was not just impressed by his great knowledge of this sector, but also other advanced sectors where we're doing a lot of work. So his background knowledge into telecommunications, and now with his new role, his work within the large community of tech companies is impressive. but also he was very familiar and passionate about Australia, I'd say passionate generally, and also very much a promoter of one of my pet topics, which is the advancement of women. So he immediately won my heart, and we've enjoyed some lovely conversations over the last 12 months that we've got to know one another. So a little bit more formally about Manoj. He's a pioneer in India's renewable energy sector. Since we got to know one another, he's now responsible for Softbank Group International in India, which manages over 20 portfolio companies and addresses public policy issues and government approvals to enable them to achieve their full business potential. If you were to take a look at that portfolio of companies with the likes of Ola and Oil, some of the big major startups coming out of India right now, it's very impressive. Similarly impressive, he was previously CEO of Bharti Airtel, and he helped build it into the third largest mobile company in the world with over 400 million customers. Joining us today also is Patrick Suckling. Patrick's a non-resident senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and notably he formerly served as Australia's ambassador for the environment. I've previously met Patrick in his role as the Australian High Commissioner to India, and also remember him as being highly passionate about his time in India, which predated mine in the country. And he's also headed the international area of Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. So two such incredibly qualified speakers to talk to us today. And I look forward to hearing an insightful discussion. Thanks, Patrick and Manoj.
Thank you, Michelle.
Well, thank you, Michelle and Philippe, for those generous introductions, and welcome, Manoj, to the role that you've just undertaken for the Asia Society in Australia. It's terrific to see someone of your eminence and your expertise and knowledge be in this role to genuinely help build those bridges that we need between our two countries. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. I do recall as High Commissioner for Australia in India, how active and how strategic the state of Victoria was, and how energetic the different commissioners from Victoria and the delegations that came through were in terms of looking for opportunities for connections, building relationships across a vast spectrum of activities. And so it's great to see, Michelle, you carrying on that tradition now. We're just going to have a few, really question and answer type of discussions today, Manoj, because we want to benefit from your great expertise and having you on the line. So I think we'll see how long we go with the different answers, because time has been somewhat truncated, but I thought I'll ask maybe 4 or 5 questions, Manoj, just to get your perspective on climate change in India. And it is good to be focusing on climate change today. COVID has become all-consuming, but climate change is not going away. In fact, on all the evidence, climate change, the negative impacts will get worse and worse, and the urgency of dealing with climate change has not been postponed because of our distraction and preoccupation with COVID. And in fact, COVID is, in some senses, a harbinger of the sorts of disasters and the need that we need, the need for us to build resilience into how we deal with these sorts of impacts, and pandemics have been one of many negative impacts associated with growing climate change. And so in that sense, there's a bit of a window through COVID to a world that we all want to avoid, and therefore climate change is still a very important topic. And in that context, India is always viewed as critical to achieving success in addressing the threats of climate change. Obviously, partly because India is such a large emitter. It's the 3rd largest emitter in the world after the United States and China, but also because India is at an economic stage of development where the investment decisions that India makes over the next couple of decades will have a very significant impact on global emissions profile. And therefore, there is an imperative that many countries, communities, people feel about India's climate action. India has committed to a target of reducing its emissions intensity by 35% by 2030. Some people say that's quite a modest target. Other people say, in the context of India's economic growth and other challenges, that's a significant target. That's something that will continue to be debated. India certainly says that as a developing country, it needs support, means of implementation, whether it's finance or technology or capacity building, to help meet the challenges of climate change. India's economy, even before the COVID crisis, had been going on a downward trend for all sorts of different reasons. There's now a question of, coming out of COVID recovery, does climate change get put aside, or do you build into your COVID recovery stimulus mechanisms that also help transition the economy to lower emissions, more climate resilient outcomes? And that's a debate that will, I think, be talked about throughout coming months as different governments put in place stimulus and recovery packages, but also, I'm sure, throughout next year and probably the year beyond. So there are a lot of issues in there, Manoj, but I just thought to ask you for your headline assessment of where you think India is up to in terms of its climate commitments and meeting its climate challenges and contributing to the global effort to meet the Paris Agreement goals.
Thank you, Patrick. I feel that the positive side effect of COVID-19 is that it's a good introspection time. I think we are introspecting our direction, our pace of achievement in climate change, and should it change, should it improve further? And let me tell you that India has 6 out of top 10 most polluted cities in the world, which is really a bad news. And but the great thing is that the Prime Minister, with his great vision, has taken up a commitment of, as you rightly said, 35% reduction in emission by 2030 with a 2005 base. And that, along with industrialization, along with development, along with so much more manufacturing to enter India in the next few years. So reduction while you're enhancing the economic development, I think, is a very tough task. The second thing which Prime Minister has taken a commitment is that 450 gigawatt of renewable energy, which includes solar, wind, and biomass energy, has already been taken. We have already completed about 87 gigawatt out of that, which is a good start. Long way to go, 450 by 2030, which is 40% of India's energy need. And I feel that India is making progress, good progress. And the way I have seen the government, and especially the Prime Minister himself, he will not only be committed, but he'll enhance these actions to save the climate change which we are seeing across the world. So that I'm confident of.
Well, that's a very encouraging perspective, Manoj. Just on the renewable energy story, because that is the big story. That's currently the centerpiece of India's actions on climate change. And as you said, a 450 gigawatt target by 2030, a target of 175 gigawatts minimum by 2022. As I understand it, already an installed capacity of 87 gigawatts so far. India leading a global alliance called the Solar Alliance to accelerate different solar technologies through research and development and partnerships across the world. So from an Indian perspective, an enormous emphasis on renewable energy as a solution. And at the moment, from what we're hearing, the prices of renewable energy are between 20 to 35% cheaper now than coal-fired power. So in that sense, a very positive story. And I did see Prime Minister Modi last year. We were at the UN summit, special summit on climate change, and Prime Minister Modi emphasized renewable energy as India's great contribution. Manoj, do you think that India will stay on track to meet that in its extraordinary target of 450 gigawatts by 2030? And do you think focusing just on renewable energy is sufficient to get India to where it needs to get to in terms of climate action?
No, India is on track. I believe that there's no reason to say that India will do less. I feel that the pace of growth could be better in the years to come. The issues of land allocation, the issues of transmission, infrastructure build-up, issues of bidding processes, financing, all the issues are being resolved systematically by the government and by the industry. I feel that there are some other imperatives also. One, that India imports more than 100 to 110 billion a year of oil, crude oil, which actually is a huge burden on its foreign exchange reserves. So that is an important energy security matter which government is sensitive to. Second is that not only India is committed to its own target, but also helping the new areas in the sunshine zone, where the sunshine is great. Like in India, it's great. In Australia, it's great. In Africa, in LATAM, it's great. To help another 120 countries to build their solar mission, because the sunshine is a resource which you have, God has given you. So I think sunshine, wind, which again is a God-given gift. So we should utilize these resources, which are free in that sense compared to importing 100 billion of oil. And I feel that realization is very, very high in India now. So therefore, I feel the climate change actions, in addition to renewable energy, the other action government is initiated is the EVs, electric vehicles, where India has thought of EVs very seriously, fixed some targets for initiating the new vehicles or stopping the old IC engine vehicles. Also, a huge focus on storage battery, where storage battery, ESS, will be used about 94% in the next 10 years for power sector and about only 6% for the EV sector. So battery becomes very, very important part of both renewable energy sector as well as EV sector. So it's a very holistic plan which the country has made, and now the execution is on focus. The industry is very enthusiastic. And for example, India has done many innovations. For example, solar parks. You know, India has 6.5 million square kilometers of wasteland, and state governments are aggregating wasteland to build solar parks of 2, 3, 4 gigawatt each, so that developers can come there, build their solar plants or wind plants, and really start generating as early as possible. And the transmission also infrastructure has reached to the solar parks. So these are some innovations the country has done, which I think the world can, and Australia and India can work together to utilize and leverage these innovations together.
Yeah, thank you, Manoj. And as you say, I mean, there are some challenges around transmission capacity, land, finance, tariffs, renegotiation of tariffs, import duties on different solar modules. But from what you say, those are being worked through and will be worked through in the context of this very strong commitment to transitioning to cleaner energy that India's currently embarked on. I'm coming from the business world. Do you see Indian companies embracing this agenda as well? And one of the remarkable things to see before COVID sideswiped us all over the last year is how many companies worldwide are making very significant commitments to climate action, to addressing climate change, to actually integrating climate transition risks, opportunities into their business as a core part of business. And there seems to be a growing recognition by business, particularly as they start implementing the guidelines around risk, climate risk and opportunities, that this isn't some sort of sideshow for their business. It's front and center in terms of as the former governor of the Bank of England has said, that companies that don't adjust won't survive in different sectors and industries. And so it is focusing the business mind, helped by regulators, helped by governments. But what we were seeing out of Australia globally was a very strong corporate drive for stronger climate action, stronger climate commitments, and pressure on governments to sometimes follow the lead of business. Are you seeing that in India? I mean, for example, there's the Adani Group has had some controversy in Australia, but nevertheless they are saying that they will be the biggest renewable energy company in the world by 2023. You have the Mahindra Group that's leading the world and showcasing what it's doing around the world at the WEF and in the United Nations on its commitment to science-based targets and to climate action. You have other groups like Dalmia Cement looking at how to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors in India. What's the sense you get of corporate India getting onto this agenda?
No, corporate India has realized two things. Number one, that they need to become green companies and they need to produce green products. And because they will get better acceptance from the customers if they do that. Number two, they have realized that it is affordable, more affordable to use renewable energy. And it is more profitable. It will have a positive impact on their P&L account. So in the last 2 to 3 years, we have seen a positive momentum by small, medium, and even very large scale companies towards solar and wind energy. We have had discussions with energy guzzlers like cement industry, steel industry, mining, data centers, and aluminium production. Now, these are energy guzzlers where 30 to 40% of the cost goes for energy usage. So these companies especially are very interested because they will like to have a positive green impact as well as P&L impact. Now, the only missing piece here is the cost of ESS, the cost of storage battery, which is high today. I believe till the cost comes down to 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour, I think the very large scale replacement of fossil will not happen. Now that may take another 3 years, 4 years. It's difficult to give a precise time because then renewable energy will be 24/7. If it is 24/7, then the replacement of fossil becomes much easier. Today, because it is intermittent, it is not 24/7. Hence, partial replacement is taking place. So I see it with great potential in future, except that this issue of cost of ESS and storage battery needs to be managed, needs to be dealt with, which may take another 3-4 years.
Yeah. And just in terms of the list that you rolled off there, in terms of what companies are looking at and investing in, there's obviously enormous commercial opportunities in transition, and it's trillions of dollars worth to the global economy. On some estimates, it's $1.6 to $3.8 trillion every year to the year 2050 in clean energy alone, if we're going to meet our Paris Agreement commitment. So that gives you some sense of the scale of commercial opportunity, investment, trade opportunities. Australia and India have a long-standing trade and investment relationship over the last 20 years. That's been going from strength to strength. It's genuinely strategic in all sorts of different ways. For example, Australia is providing energy requirements into India, but we're also helping with technologies in agriculture, in education and skills, in all sorts of areas that are very important for India's for India to maximize its economic growth. This is another area of opportunity, and Australia being a famous resource country, I mean, there are obviously the resource dimensions to silica for solar panels, for example, or lithium and cobalt, and that sort of traditional Australian resource-based opportunity, but there are opportunities in infrastructure, green, clean, smart infrastructure, in agriculture, same thing. I just wonder how you see those sorts of potential linkages between India and Australia in this new and evolving and very exciting space.
No, I see 3 very big linkages, which I will like to help Asia Society to bridge. One is, as you rightly said, agriculture. Agriculture is big for Australia, it's big for India. And I think how we can work together in agriculture, how we can improve the productivity, how we can convert all the electricity required to renewable energy. Because in India, we are doing many solar pumps for the irrigation purposes. And I'm sure Australia will also be doing that. So I'm saying that agriculture is a big area of collaboration. Luckily, because of Green Revolution, India food production is okay. We are able to feed 1.3 billion people and also export a bit, which is good news. But we need to further improve the productivity. And I'm sure Australia does better. The second area, as we discussed, is renewable energy. Not only renewable energy in terms of generation, but also manufacturing of various components. India does manufacture nearly all the components. The scale is low. It needs to improve, but it does manufacture the inverters, the transformers, the modules, the windmills, etc., etc. And I think we should work together. Other is the using engineering talent, which I think Australia has and India has, for EPC and O&M areas, for project areas, because our engineers are bright, your engineers are bright. We should really give them a chance to work with each other and in each other countries. And the third area, which I see is very important, is in the EV sector, which is again a sector, automotive sector, where IC engines will move definitely to EV. What storage batteries are required, many other components are required, and your automotive sector is large, our automotive sector is large. So I'm saying these are some very spontaneous collaboration opportunities which we should take up. And the side effect will be that Australia will be able to achieve climate change goals faster, and India will be able to do the same.
That's a very nice way to end our conversation, Manoj. It's always so exciting talking to colleagues from India, because whenever we do begin to talk, there are just endless possibilities between our two countries. I always found that as High Commissioner in India, we were never short of conversation, and we do have genuinely strategic interests, whether it's economic or whether it's security, or whether it's even people to people, and how many wonderful people from India are choosing to make their future in Australia and add to our communities. How many Australians are looking to India to further their understanding of the world, to build businesses, to make connections. It's something that maybe you don't notice year on year, but certainly decade on decade, the relationship between Australia and India is really going from strength to strength, and it's wonderful to have you on board. So Philipp, I think we're pushing against time, so I think we should hand over to you for some questions.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Manoj. Fascinating conversation. We have a few questions coming up. The first one, I guess, to both of you. Do you think it will be harder or easier to reach any international agreement on climate change post-COVID-19 crisis? Maybe we'll start with Manoj.
No, I think it will be easier. Because, you know, in the last 2 months, I have never seen as many birds and animals and green as I've seen in the last 2 months. In NC, I live in Delhi, so I think the number of butterflies I'm seeing, so I think people are feeling the change. People are saying that climate change actually is much more important, and with this lockdown period, one can see the positive impact. And I think even in government, I think there's a feeling that this is the way to go, and we should reinforce our commitments and do better. So I feel it'll expedite the pace.
I would agree with that. And, you know, the impacts of climate are just becoming ever more evident. And we only have to look at our summer of hell in Australia with the bushfires to know that communities are now seeing and feeling the impacts of climate. And that itself is driving pressure for change around the world, as are the blue skies in Delhi that we see pictures of, or people in the Punjab being able to see the snow peaks of the Himalayas for the first time in 30 years. You know, I just would say we have an international agreement, the Paris Agreement, one of the most historic agreements of all time, not only because 195 parties agreed to it, and most of them have ratified the Paris Agreement, but it is an agreement that includes all countries. Developed countries, developing countries, albeit developing countries have some flexibility for their circumstances and seek support, and developed countries have agreed to provide support for climate action for developing countries. But you know, the negotiations that we've been doing on climate change for the last 15 to 20 years are, in some senses, when I was ambassador for the environment last year on the climate change negotiations, the narrative was moving to, we're pretty much done with negotiations and treaties. We've got the Paris Agreement. We have to implement, we have to move to action, we have to move to ambition. And you're seeing that action and that ambition happening just because, for example, companies are saying this is core business. Climate change for us is core business because of the risks that we have to manage, because of the opportunities we have to take advantage of and repurpose our business. And so they will drive action on climate change. So I think the Paris Agreement has one small element, which is around markets, that has to be resolved in future negotiations. But by and large, there is a rock solid, strong international agreement with very strong, robust rules, common platform for all countries to make their commitments, to be transparent, to report their progress on, for peer pressure, for encouragement, for learning by doing and facilitation to occur. That's a very positive dynamic. So I think we will see all of that combination drive climate action ever stronger.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Manoj. A question from our audience, which you've answered some aspects of it. What Australia-India energy relationship will look like in the next few years? And will we witness a shift away from coal and more focus on efficient technologies, export of critical minerals, for example, like lithium? I know you touched on that, Manoj and Patrick, but do you want to explain a little bit more on that? Maybe start with Manoj.
There is a dichotomy. Both Australia and India have huge coal reserves. But at the same time, both India and Australia have huge solar and wind potentials also. So I feel that in a very systematic and orderly fashion, both the countries have to move towards solar and wind, because that's a permanent, sustainable resource they have. And that leads to much cleaner environment. And both of us need clean environment. And if lithium resource is required, that's essential for ESS and storage battery. So I'm sure India and Australia will work together how to utilize it more, because that's an essential feature of 24/7 service in next few years.
Thanks, Manoj. Patrick, just to sort of a slightly different direction here. Australia has taken a very active approach to developing particular economic relationship with India in the last 2 years. The government has endorsed India economic strategy. It's a very ambitious plan to make India our top economic partner. What's your assessment of the prospect of Australia's economic relationship with India more generally?
Well, as we were discussing before, I think there's a very bright prospect. I mean, and it may not be evident year on year, but certainly decade on decade, it's extraordinary, the depth and the breadth of the economic relationship and the potential for further links. And that's partly because our economies provide complementarities to one another, and so in that sense, in some areas we don't compete. We support one another. So a classic is all of the energy things we've been discussing to meet India's vast energy needs over the next couple of decades. Another one, as Manoj was emphasizing, is agriculture and successive green and greener revolutions that are going to have to come to India and Australia in terms of the way we do, how productive we are, and how we're able to get abatement out of our farming. So there are always connections with climate change. The tourism is an enormous area of potential. The education links that I talked about, technology in all sorts of different dimensions, defense is another area. So there are very significant synergies between our two economies. India is obviously going to continue to grow very significantly. At the moment, India's growth is not optimal, shall we say. and COVID will clearly impact that even more. But longer term, India's prospects are very bright in terms of its economic growth trajectory. And for Australia to be able to be a partner in that, as Australia also grows and continues to be one of the top 15 economies in the world, and growing Indian corporate interest in Australia. I think the deeper those links are, the stronger our business to business connections become. The more we understand one another in our business environments, the stronger the business we'll do together will be. And it's absolutely inevitable. And as I say, if you look at it decade on decade, it's moving fast. And in 10 years' time, we'll be amazed how much further down the road our economic relationship is.
Do you find that there are gaps perhaps in the sort of the level of interaction between Australian and Indian business leaders at the sort of the top 200, 300 companies in both nations? And what do you think can be done on a practical level to facilitate these exchanges? To you, Patrick, I guess, to start with.
Okay. The B2B, as I was mentioning, is not as strong as it should be. Partly that's been a lot of Australian CEOs have been engaged with China for the last couple of decades if they've been looking offshore. There's not a deep knowledge and familiarity with India, the market, the people, a whole range of things. Similarly, in the Indian context, a lot of Indian business has been domestically focused or looked towards the US or Europe. So there is work to be done in terms of forging business to business links, understanding partnerships, and clearly governments can play an important role in that in terms of the sorts of things that have been recommended in that report that you mentioned, the report to 2035. But also, and that can include governments like Victoria, which is doing a good job through business delegations and through networking and linking different business partners through investment opportunities. But obviously the Asia Society itself, and the simple fact that Manoj is here talking to us today, is a really important part of building those B2B links. So on all sorts of different levels, yes, it's not something that has been natural in the past. 30, 40 years ago, we just didn't really look at one another. In the last 20 years, increasingly, our eyes are meeting. And in that context, businesses are looking at one another and getting to know one another better. But it's coming off a low base compared to other places, for example, China. And in that context, there is work to be done by governments and by business to forge those connections and make them stronger and deeper.
Thanks, Patrick. And going back to our subject, question to you, Manoj, from one of our viewers. India is embarking on one of the fastest rural to urban transitions in the region, if not the world, with the rapid growth of its cities. How can India, in your view, plan for this and ensure the transition do not add to rising carbon emissions?
Very, very good question. India has nearly 500 million people in rural areas. And many of those people are employed only for a partial year when the harvesting season is on or some other rural activity is going on. So many of them over the next decade will naturally move towards urban areas if new opportunities are not created in villages. So I think the biggest opportunity for India is to undertake a very conscious plan to upgrade the villages, upgrade the small towns. We have 600,000 villages. And those, if the villages are upgraded and new factories, new businesses, new call centers, whatever can be built around the villages, then the urbanization will slow down, because we don't need an unplanned urbanization. We need a very planned, steady urbanization. So once we are able to give a very high quality working opportunity, employment opportunity close to the village, I think that is the best, not only in terms of a orderly urbanization, but also for improving the carbon emission situation.
Thanks so much, Manoj. And I guess this is a good point to complete our event. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I again apologize for the technical issues, but first of all, let me congratulate you, Manoj, on becoming a Victoria Asia Society Distinguished Fellow. You've got a pretty big and ambitious agenda to bring Australia and India closer together, and we look forward to welcoming you to Australia sometime very soon, hopefully. And also, I guess before we go, a quick question to you. What would be your #1 goal for the fellowship? What do you want to achieve?
No, I think what Patrick mentioned was very important. There is definitely a great opportunity to build solid bridges. I think we have got stuck with cricket. I think we need to get out of cricket and do very serious industry and business together. So the trade can improve dramatically. And what Patrick again said was right, that India knows more US, Europe, Japan maybe, and Australia was much more with some other parts of the world. So it's important that we recognize each other as very important trading partners and build bridges of factories, build bridges of solar, wind, EVs, many. So I think that is my singular goal, to raise the bar of trade and commerce.
Well, thank you so much, Manoj, and we will do everything that we can to help you on this mission. And again, congratulations on your appointment. And to Patrick, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts. Very important topic, and we will continue talking about the climate change and the green revolution in the context of Asia, both at Asia Society Australia and across our 13 centres. And to all our listeners, thanks for joining. Again, apologies for technical problems, and we hope to see you again at our programs, which we now run at very regularly weekly. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Philipp.
Thank you.
Manoj.